Hey, today we're going to talk about 2.1, Introduction to Biodiversity. So take a moment, review the enduring understanding, check out the learning objective, and pause the video, review the essential knowledge, and set up your Cornell notes. So this topic of biodiversity is probably the most important thing that we're going to discuss this entire year. And biodiversity just means the overall number of different organisms that are living in a particular area. But it's also tied with, whenever you want to say harm to the environment or it's bad for the planet or anything like that, there's a better way of responding to a certain question. And we always want to bring it back to biodiversity. You don't ever want to say it's bad for the environment, it's bad for the planet, it harms the earth. Those are generic statements that you never want to make. What we always want to do is we want to bring it to biodiversity loss. And biodiversity loss, we can remember it because we can use the acronym HIPCO. Now, according to the College Board, they like to have an extra P, HIPPCO, and the extra P stands for population, which is human population. But my thought process is, if we didn't have a huge human population, we wouldn't have these other problems anyway. So I think it's kind of just redundant. Now, each of these are causes for biodiversity loss. So we can have habitat loss. That's like habitat destruction. We can have invasive species like zebra mussels coming into an area and they can outcompete. We can have pollution, which we're going to talk about in this second semester. We can have climate change, which we'll also talk about in the second semester. And we can also have overharvesting, and that's like if you overfish or you hunt too many organisms. So all of these are factors that can contribute to biodiversity loss. So biodiversity, we can have genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is related to variation or differences in a population. We can have species diversity, and species diversity is related to the number of species that we have. So genetic diversity is within one species, and species diversity can be between different species. And finally, we can have ecosystem diversity, and that ecosystem diversity can relate to the number of different habitats that we have. Now, all of these can contribute to biodiversity, and they can help an ecosystem respond to a stressor. An environmental stressor is something that happens that can kind of shake up an environment or an ecosystem, like, for example, a forest fire or a flood. But it can also provide ecosystem services, and these are things that ecosystems provide for humans. We'll discuss that in a future video. So genetic diversity, just to refresh, genetic diversity, remember this right here is DNA, and DNA is a series of bases, and part of the DNA is a gene. And this gene is specific because it provides the directions to make a protein. So the DNA does not make proteins. The DNA is basically the recipe. Follow these steps and then you'll make a protein. And a protein is a particular molecule that is bent into shape that performs a specific function within a cell. Proteins do many, many different things. They're the basic building blocks of all biotic organisms. Now, within this genetic diversity, we can have different genotypes. And just remember that a genotype is a sequence. It's just the bases, the A's, the T's, the C's, and the G's that make up the genes. So the genotype could be the long sequence of A, T, C, C, G, G, A, C, G, whatever it is. And then we can have a phenotype based on those proteins. These proteins, when you put them in order, or you construct something out of them, like bricks, maybe making a building out of bricks or Legos, for example, you will get a phenotype. And the phenotype is the physical appearance. So based on the phenotype, an organism can survive stresses in an environment. Now, over time, things might happen. You may get a mutation. And a mutation is when there is a change in the DNA. So one little part of this protein may have changed because there may have been a sequence of bases may have changed in the DNA that relates to a mutation in the protein that results from that. Now, sometimes these mutations can be good, sometimes these mutations can be bad. But mutations are the drivers for evolution. Okay, so different ways of measuring biodiversity is we can measure by species richness and species evenness. Species richness is the number of species in an ecosystem, and the evenness is the balance of the individuals. So here's a couple of examples. These two on the left will have high richness because there is a high number of species that are present in each one of these ecosystems. Now on the right, we're going to have low richness because there's a low number of species that are present. Now, these are going to have low evenness because there's not a good balance between the number of organisms in each ecosystem. This one is overwhelmingly blue, this one is overwhelmingly red. That's not very balanced, that is not even. Now these are going to have high evenness. So because they have a very good balance, it seems like it is equally spread between the different colors. So you can have high richness and low evenness. You can have low evenness and high richness, and vice versa. Now, one thing that can impact the diversity of an ecosystem is something called a bottleneck effect. Now, this is just a simulation, but whenever you get an environmental stressor, like for example, it's like pouring a liquid or pouring something out of a bottleneck. So bottleneck is you have a limited area where everything can exit from the bottle. So the speed at which you're going to pour liquid out of this bottle is determined by the size of the bottleneck. So whenever there's an environmental stressor, what's going to happen is some of these organisms are going to survive. Now, if you notice, the organisms that survived are not necessarily the same organisms that were present, or the same ratio that were present in the original population. So you may have lower diversity because these organisms, the blue and the white ones, were better equipped to survive in this environment. So what's going to happen over time? You're actually going to have only the blue and the white ones are going to reproduce. So even though in the original population you had an overwhelmingly large number of red organisms, in the new population you have mostly blue organisms. So the diversity of this ecosystem, the genetic diversity, is going to be lower. And that could lead to extinction, especially if there's another environmental stressor that these organisms are not equipped to survive. You may have inbreeding depression. And inbreeding depression is when you have reduced diversity. So different organisms are going to be breeding with other organisms within their species. So if you have lower diversity, like is the case in the top, you may have more mutations when there is inbreeding depression. Whenever you have organisms that are closely related, you have a higher rate of mutations, and certain phenotypes will show up that are non-beneficial traits. So this could happen whenever you have inbreeding depression, and that could lead to extinction, which is a problem. And just remember, extinction is when all of the organisms of a particular species die. And this can be globally, or it can be extinction within an ecosystem. So ecosystem resilience is how well an ecosystem responds to these environmental stressors. Resilience, now some ecosystems are going to be better than others. When you have increased diversity, you'll be better able to survive these stressors, which means you can recover at a much faster rate. So in these two ecosystems, we have a taiga, a coniferous forest, which is very low or relatively low genetic diversity, at least from what I can see. And here it looks like we have a tropical rainforest where the genetic diversity is much higher. So in these two ecosystems, the rainforest is going to have higher resilience. I would like you to practice an FRQ writing. Assuming that each colored circle represents a unique species, justify which ecosystem would better survive an environmental stressor. Formulate your response, and we will share them out next time we meet in class. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that this video was helpful. I will see you soon.